Welcome to AI Radio. Today, we'll discuss the most important current affairs from the Hindu 16 May 2026 edition with detailed analysis for UPSC aspirants. You can access today's notes from the description box below. Your comments and feedback help us improve and create better content for aspirants every day. Thank you for supporting AI Radio.
Yeah, we have a really packed and quite fascinating briefing for you today.
So to kick things off, I want you to think about this for a second. Right now, oil marketing companies in India are bleeding, like 1,000 crore rupees every single day.
Which is just a staggering number to wrap your head around.
Right. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the US and China are trying to basically divide the globe into this G2 duopoly. And today, we're going to show you how those two seemingly unrelated facts are actually on a direct collision course.
Exactly. It's all about systemic resilience today. We're looking at how different systems, from educational testing bodies to entire geopolitical strategies, adapt when their vulnerabilities are exposed.
And let's start with a vulnerability that has affected millions of families recently. The NEET exam reforms.
Right, the medical entrance exams.
Yeah. So the retest is officially scheduled for June 21st. They are waiving all the fees for students taking it and adding 15 minutes to the duration. But the real structural shift is happening next year.
Oh yeah, moving away from the physical OMR sheets.
Exactly. They're entirely scrapping those physical optical mark recognition bubbles and shifting to a computer-based test, or CBT. And just this week, the CBI arrested an alleged kingpin, PV Kulkarni, in Pune.
Right, the guy who was allegedly dictating exact leaked questions in his coaching classes.
Yeah, that's the one. Okay, let's unpack this. We constantly hear about these leaks, but it seems like the physical OMR system itself is the root of the problem. It's like a massive fortress, but it has a completely leaky basement.
That is like the perfect way to visualize it.
Yeah.
When you rely on physical OMR sheets, you're relying on a wildly fragile logistical chain. I mean, you have printing presses, physical transportation across the country, local strong rooms.
Right, so many moving parts.
Exactly. Every single human touch point is a potential compromise. But by shifting to a CBT, you fundamentally alter the architecture of the exam. The paper is centrally encrypted.
So no one can intercept it in transit.
Right. It literally doesn't exist anywhere in the world until moments before the student sits down. When it gets decrypted on their local terminal, it just bypasses that entire physical supply chain.
So it's essentially taking the human element out of it. But, going digital obviously isn't a silver bullet. We're actually seeing the dark side of that right now with the rise of these terrifying digital arrest scams.
Oh, those have become so incredibly common, and they are vicious.
They really are. And the CBI has just launched an AI-powered verification system called Abhigh to fight this. If you get a suspicious legal notice, you can verify it on their official portal.
Which is a huge systemic step forward.
But I have to push back here. If someone is on a video call with you wearing a fake police uniform and actively threatening you...
Yeah, it's terrifying in the moment.
Right. Is an AI portal really going to stop that level of sophisticated human extortion?
Well, it won't stop the initial call, obviously, but it dismantles the psychological leverage the scammer relies on. They send these highly realistic, forged legal warrants via WhatsApp to basically paralyze you with fear.
Just creating this illusion of total authority.
Exactly. What Abhigh does is provide an immediate circuit breaker. But, honestly, the real defense is just understanding the law itself. Because a digital arrest simply does not exist in Indian jurisprudence.
Wait, really? It has no legal standing at all?
Zero. It is a completely fabricated concept. So the moment you realize the legal mechanism they're threatening you with is just fiction, and you have a portal to instantly prove the document is forged, the whole scam collapses.
Wow. Speaking of constitutional rights and state authority, there was a profound rebuke from the Supreme Court this week regarding the Noida wage protests.
Yes, this was a very significant constitutional moment.
Yeah, so the Uttar Pradesh government had labeled some of these protesters as terrorists or, left-wing sympathizers. The Supreme Court struck that down, pointing specifically to Article 43 of the Constitution.
Right, the directive principle regarding wages.
Exactly. It mandates the state to secure a living wage and a decent standard of life. Now, I want to pause on the terminology here because we constantly hear about a minimum wage in economic debates, but the court specifically cited a living wage.
Yeah, and that distinction is huge.
What changes mechanically for the state when we use that specific term?
Well, it changes the entire baseline. A minimum wage is basically just a statutory floor to prevent sheer exploitation, right?
Yeah.
It's the bare minimum for physical survival.
Right, just keeping people from starving.
Exactly. But a living wage, which Article 43 envisions, is calculated on a much broader set of metrics. It factors in dignified standards of life like healthcare, education for your kids, and basic social security.
So it's a much more comprehensive economic right. And just to be strictly impartial here, the court wasn't endorsing the specific demands of the protesters.
Right. They were remaining completely impartial on the labor demands. What the court established is a vital boundary. Citizens advocating for recognized economic rights cannot be summarily detained under severe national security laws without due process.
Okay, that makes total sense. Now, the courts are setting boundaries on labor, but they are also stepping into these incredibly deep historical disputes.
Yeah, the Madhya Pradesh High Court ruling this week is a prime example.
Right, the Bhojshala complex verdict in Dar. The court evaluated the evidence and ruled that the disputed site is actually a temple dedicated to goddess Vagdevi, or Saraswati.
Which is a massive, localized legal precedent.
It is, and they allowed the Hindu community to worship there, formally dismissing the Muslim community's claim.
And from a purely jurisprudential standpoint, you see the judiciary acting as the ultimate arbiter of historical friction here. They didn't make a ruling based on sentiment, right?
Right, they looked at the hard evidence.
Exactly. Impartially speaking, they evaluated archaeological reports and historical records to determine the original nature of the site. It shows how modern courts process these centuries-old disputes.
But you know, the courts move pretty slowly. And when you look at an active, ongoing crisis like Manipur, you realize the slow wheels of the formal judiciary aren't enough on their own.
No, you absolutely need dual tracks of conflict resolution.
Yeah, because the formal Commission of Inquiry probing the 2023 ethnic violence just got its 5th extension. It's now due in November 2026.
Which is a very methodical but very slow process.
Right. But then, this week, 28 kidnapped Nagas and Kukis were freed. And it wasn't the formal state machinery that secured their release. It was direct appeals from grassroots political and church leaders.
Which highlights exactly why you need both tracks. The formal state apparatus is bound by procedural law and evidence gathering. But on the ground, community leaders and local negotiators possess the immediate cultural capital to broker hostage releases.
So you need the bottom-up societal negotiations for immediate de-escalation, while the top-down legal framework works on long-term justice.
Precisely.
Okay, that brings us to the underlying engine that dictates so much of this state capacity, which is the economy. So let's circle back to that staggering figure I mentioned at the start.
The daily losses for the oil companies.
Yeah. Oil marketing companies are facing losses of 1,000 crore rupees every single day due to the volatility in West Asia. So the government hiked petrol and diesel prices by 3 rupees per liter and CNG by 2 rupees.
Which is actually the first major hike in 4 years.
Right. And they also slapped a windfall tax of 3 rupees per liter on petrol exports. But wait, I'm doing the math here. A 3 rupee hike is projected to generate about 4,449 crore a month. That covers maybe 4.5 days of those daily losses. Does this actually solve the problem?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it really doesn't solve it entirely. I mean, market experts calculate that a price hike closer to 10 rupees per liter is required to just bridge half of the under-recoveries.
Wow, 10 rupees. That would be a massive shock to the system.
It would. The government is attempting a very precarious balancing act. They have to throw a lifeline to the energy sector. But a 10 rupee shock would instantly trigger massive consumer inflation.
Right, because it raises the cost of transporting literally every single good across the country.
Exactly. And impartially reporting the political reality here, the opposition has heavily criticized the timing, noting this economic correction was delayed until right after the state elections concluded.
Which is a fair observation. And the ripple effects of inflation are exactly what's driving our agricultural sector to a boiling point right now.
The upcoming protests, yeah.
Yeah, the Samyukt Kisan Morcha is holding village-level protests at the end of May. They're going to burn the government orders regarding Kharif crop minimum support prices, or MSP.
And their core demand is very specific this time.
It is. They are demanding the implementation of the C2 plus 50% pricing formula, asking for 3,243 rupees per quintal for paddy.
Which is a major shift in how we value farming.
Yeah, let me break this down for you. The C2 formula isn't just about the cost of seeds or fertilizer. It factors in comprehensive imputed costs, like the rent of the farmer's own land, the interest on their capital, and the value of their family's manual labor. And then they want a 50% profit margin on top of all of that.
It really is a massive ideological shift from subsistence farming to guaranteed business viability.
Exactly.
And keeping this strictly impartial, you have two fundamentally opposing fiscal realities colliding here. Farmers argue that without this formula, agriculture is structurally a loss-making enterprise that traps them in debt.
Right, which is a terrible cycle.
But on the other side, policymakers are staring at the national balance sheet. If the state mandates a guaranteed 50% profit margin over comprehensive costs for staple crops, it drastically inflates the baseline price of food across the entire country.
So it's a brutal tug-of-war between the economic survival of the farmer and the threat of runaway national food inflation.
Exactly.
And the ultimate wild card in all of this agricultural math is, of course, the weather.
Always the weather.
Yeah. The latest forecast shows the monsoon is likely to hit Kerala early this year, between May 24 and May 26.
Which is honestly the most critical economic indicator of the year. An early, healthy monsoon is effectively a massive, naturally occurring economic stimulus package.
Because it drives up rural incomes.
Exactly. When rural India has a good harvest, that wealth translates into robust consumption. Plus, a bumper harvest keeps that very food inflation we just discussed in check, giving the RBI flexibility on interest rates.
Okay, so the monsoon basically touches every pillar of our macroeconomy. Speaking of which, I was looking at the April trade numbers, and there is a massive anomaly that completely surprised me.
The merchandise export numbers.
Yeah. We know the conflict in West Asia is causing havoc. Our exports to that region dropped by 28%. Yet somehow, India's overall merchandise exports in April surged by nearly 14% to $43.6 billion.
And lowered a trade deficit by 30% in the process.
Right. How did Indian exporters pull off a $43 billion month while bleeding out in a primary market like West Asia?
By demonstrating incredible strategic agility. You know, a decade ago, a 28% drop in a primary market would have crippled the entire quarter. But global supply chains have rewired.
So what did they do?
When the West Asia route became too perilous, Indian exporters didn't halt production. They aggressively pivoted. They found buyers in entirely different geographical pockets. We saw massive export jumps to Sri Lanka, up 215%, and Singapore, up 179%.
Wow. So they just diversified their risk across completely different geopolitical baskets.
Exactly. It highlights a newfound resilience in the trade sector.
But, you know, agility only goes so far when the rules of the game change overnight. Just look at the India-UK free trade agreement.
Yeah, that situation's getting complicated.
They were in the late stages of implementing the agreement, and out of nowhere, the UK announced a 60% cut in duty-free steel import quotas starting July 1st. And anything above that quota gets hit with a massive 50% tariff.
Which is a huge protectionist shock to the system.
Right. So how do years of delicate trade negotiations survive when one country just drops a 50% tariff surprise right at the finish line?
Well, it definitely introduces immense friction because trade relies on predictability. But this is where trade diplomacy relies on creative solutions.
Creative solutions, meaning what exactly?
Well, negotiators rarely scrap an entire comprehensive deal over one sector. Instead, they enter a phase of aggressive offset negotiations. If India accepts the steel tariffs, they will likely demand equivalent concessions elsewhere, like looser visa regulations for IT professionals.
So it becomes a game of geopolitical horse trading. And because supply chains can be weaponized so quickly with these tariffs, India is really rushing to secure its own critical manufacturing.
The rare earth magnet scheme is a perfect example of this.
Yeah, the Ministry of Heavy Industries just extended the bid deadline for its 7,280 crore rare earth magnet manufacturing scheme to June 29. Now, magnets sound like such a mundane thing to throw over 7,000 crore rupees at, but this is really about survival, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We aren't talking about refrigerator magnets here. These are highly specialized components that are the literal driving force behind 21st century tech. You cannot build an EV motor, a high-efficiency wind turbine, or an advanced missile guidance system without them.
Wow. And right now, China basically controls that entire supply chain, right?
It heavily dominates it, yes. So by incentivizing domestic manufacturing, India isn't just funding factories. It is attempting to buy strategic autonomy. If a conflict ever severed access to rare earths, our high-tech and defense manufacturing would grind to an absolute halt without domestic production.
And autonomy obviously requires deep reserves, especially energy reserves, which connects to PM Modi's recent visit to Abu Dhabi.
Right, a very strategic visit.
Yeah, he explicitly condemned the recent attacks on the UAE. But the core of that visit was signing two massive agreements. a new defense cooperation framework, and crucially, an agreement to build a 30 million barrel strategic petroleum reserve located right here in India.
This is a perfect illustration of how military strategy and energy security are now completely intertwined. Storing 30 million barrels locally protects the Indian economy from immediate supply shocks if the Red Sea becomes impassable.
It's a mutually beneficial leverage, really.
Exactly. India locks down its energy security, and the UAE tightly binds its defense apparatus to a stabilizing partner in a very volatile neighborhood.
And that neighborhood is incredibly fractured right now, which we saw play out in real time at the recent BRICS foreign ministers meeting.
The internal friction there was very telling.
Yeah, on paper, they issued a unified statement supporting an independent Palestine within the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital. But behind closed doors, Iran and the UAE were fiercely arguing about the Strait of Hormuz and their approaches to the U.S. and Israel.
Which is a major geopolitical rift.
So how does a multilateral group like BRICS actually issue a joint statement if the members are actively fighting in the back room?
Through a very specific diplomatic instrument called a chair's statement. Normally, you aim for a joint communique, which requires absolute consensus. But when fractures are too deep, like between Iran and the UAE right now, total consensus fails.
So they just issue a summary instead.
Exactly. The host issues a summary highlighting broad areas of agreement, like Palestinian statehood, while gently papering over the severe internal divisions to project an illusion of unified strength.
That makes a lot of sense. Which brings us to the biggest geopolitical friction point of all. President Trump and President Xi just met in Beijing. They discussed trade and Taiwan, and Trump explicitly referred to the two nations as the G2.
That phrasing is incredibly significant.
Right. I mean, here's where it gets really interesting. They walked away with massive transactional agreements. China is buying 200 Boeing aircraft, and the U.S. is allowing NVIDIA to sell highly restricted tech chips to 10 Chinese firms. Calling yourselves the G2 implies you view yourselves as a global duopoly, standing head and shoulders above everyone else.
And this raises an important question for strategic scholars regarding what they call the Thucydides trap. History suggests that when a rising power threatens a hegemon, it leads to conflict. What we are witnessing is an attempt to stabilize that rivalry through massive transactional diplomacy.
Trading planes for microchips to keep the peace.
Exactly. But this G2 concept is deeply concerning for a rising middle power like India. A multipolar world allows middle powers to negotiate. A G2 world forces everyone else to navigate rules written exclusively by a duopoly in Washington and Beijing.
Finally, as a stark reminder that while superpowers attempt to carve up the globe, non-traditional threats don't respect borders. Africa's top public health agency just confirmed a new Ebola outbreak in the DRC's Ituri province.
And this is a non-Zaire strain, which is concerning.
Yeah. So far, there are 246 suspected cases and 65 deaths. It's a very sobering reality check. An epidemiological crisis in a conflict zone can instantly ripple outward, requiring a coordinated global response that transcends all this geopolitical posturing.
Precisely. A virus doesn't care about the Thucydides trap or duty-free steel quotas. It exploits the vulnerabilities of our interconnected world just as efficiently as a digital scammer exploits the vulnerabilities of our communications.
So true. Well, looking at the big picture today, from the CBI upgrading its tech to fight physical and digital fraud, to local fuel pumps hiking prices because of a war in the Middle East, to the U.S. and China trying to run the world as a G2 corporate board. The ultimate takeaway is that the boundary between domestic policy and global strategy has completely collapsed.
They are entirely fused.
Right. You cannot understand local farm protests without understanding global inflation, and you cannot understand global trade without looking at the supply of rare earth magnets.
Which brings us to a vital underlying tension that I want to leave you with today. As we watch the U.S. and China attempt to formalize this G2 global system, consider how domestic pressures act as an anchor. How do intense local economic demands, like farmers fighting for the C2 plus 50% MSP formula, or a government scrambling to cover 1,000 crore daily fuel loss constraint, a rising power's ability to exert leverage on the global stage?
That's a great point.
Right. Can a nation project true strategic autonomy abroad, dictating terms to a G2 duopoly if it's constantly battling immediate economic fires at home?
Wow, that is a fascinating question to chew on today. The strength of the state abroad is entirely dependent on the stability of the soil at home. You can access today's notes from the description box below. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time on AI Radio.